The sound of grinding metal echoes in the cold underground workshop as the massive vault door finally groans open. Leo, a broke veteran, is just 1 second away from a life-changing discovery. But his partner, Shadow, a retired K9, suddenly goes rigid. A low, threatening growl vibrates from deep in the shepherd's chest. He isn't looking at the treasure. He is staring, unblinking, into the pitch-black tunnel they just came from. They have found the vault, but something has just found them. The clock on the wall displayed 2:04 a.m. As always, Leo was awake. He sat on the edge of his bed in the cramped studio apartment, his breath catching in his chest. It was not a nightmare that woke him, but the silence after it. A silence that his mind quickly filled with the echo of shattering glass and a single, sharp command that had been his last. Leo, a man in his mid-30s, looked worn down by an exhaustion that sleep could not fix. He was a former K9 handler, a veteran of 1,000 high-stakes searches. But one failed mission had ended his career and left his nerves frayed and exposed. A heavy sigh came from the floor. Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd, lifted his magnificent head. His coat was a thick, handsome mix of silver gray and white, paler than the usual black and tan. He was not just Leo's retired partner, he was his anchor. The dog rose, his movements fluid, and walked over to Leo. He did not bark or whine. He simply pushed his head firmly under Leo's trembling hand and leaned his full weight against his leg. Leo exhaled, the knot in his chest loosening. He buried his fingers in the thick fur. "Just another night, huh, boy?" he whispered. Shadow's steady breathing was the only sound that mattered. 3 days later, the letter arrived. It was from a law firm in Oregon. Leo stared at the eviction notice taped to his refrigerator, then back at the thick, expensive envelope. His financial situation was desperate. He had been named the sole heir to the estate of Alara Vance, a great-aunt he barely remembered, a name from his mother's childhood stories. He was, the letter confirmed, the last of the Vance line. The inheritance was a property. Sea-Watch Tower, in the coastal town of Port Coldwater. There was no choice. He packed his few belongings into his old pickup truck, Shadow climbing eagerly into the passenger seat. They arrived in Port Coldwater under a bruised purple sky. The town was a small, misty harbor huddling against the vast, angry Pacific. Sea-Watch Tower was not a house. It was a fortress, or perhaps a tomb. A dark Gothic structure of stone and timber perched precariously on a cliff's edge. It looked like it was in a constant battle with the wind. Their first night was a trial. A fierce storm blew in, rattling the antique windows and sending a low howl through the chimneys. The sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks below was a violent, repeating thunder. Leo's anxiety spiked. He was pacing the grand, cold library, the memory of his failed mission mixing with the roar of the storm. But Shadow was not anxious. He was not pacing or hiding. He was focused. Ignoring the wind, Shadow walked directly to a section of dark wooden wall paneling between 2 tall bookshelves. He sniffed the air, then pressed his nose against the wood. A low, curious whuffing sound came from his throat. He sniffed the panel from top to bottom, his tail giving a single, inquisitive wag. Then he gently nudged one spot with his muzzle. He looked back at Leo, then back at the wall, as if to say, This is interesting." The next few days were spent clearing cobwebs and broken glass. Leo, accustomed to military routine, worked methodically, trying to make a small corner of the kitchen livable. On the 3rd morning, the quiet was broken by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A black luxury sedan, silent and sleek, looked completely alien against the backdrop of the crumbling tower. A man in a tailored wool coat stepped out. His leather shoes were polished to a mirror shine, a ridiculous choice for the muddy, overgrown path. This was Marcus Thorne. He appeared to be in his 50s with a sharp, angular face and silver hair swept back from his temples. He moved with an air of absolute ownership, his smile practiced and cold. "Mr. Vance, I presume?" Thorne's voice was smooth as he extended a manicured hand. Leo wiped his own on his jeans before shaking it. "It's Leo. Just Leo. Marcus Thorne, the man said. My firm handles most of the high-value real estate on this coast. I was very sorry to hear of Alara's passing. My agents notified me the estate was finally being settled. Thorne gestured dismissively at the soaring stone walls. It's a heavy burden, this place. A real teardown, if I'm honest. The Historical Society will fight you on demolition, and the permits to restore it, well, he gave a sympathetic chuckle. Look, I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 right now, cash, just to take this ruin off your hands. As Thorne took a step closer, as if to share a secret, Shadow stood up. The shepherd had been sitting by the truck, observing. Now he moved with silent purpose, placing his gray and white body physically between Leo and the approaching man. Shadow did not bark or snarl. A low, steady rumble simply vibrated in his deep chest, a sound that was less an accusation than a clear statement of fact. Thorne froze, his smile tightening. You should keep that dog leashed. He's fine, Leo said, his hand dropping to rest on Shadow's head. The dog's presence was a warm, solid wall. And the offer is an insult. I'm not selling. The encounter left Leo deeply unsettled. Thorne's offer was too fast, too rehearsed. He wanted the property, and he wanted it cheap. Suspicion drove him into town. He found the Port Coldwater Historical Archive, a small, dusty room smelling of old paper tucked behind the town library. The man behind the desk was Mr. Arris, an elderly gentleman with wire-rimmed glasses, a kind, wrinkled face, and a cozy cardigan. "Can I help you, son?" Arris asked. "I'm looking for information on Alara Vance," Leo said, "and the Thorne family." Mr. Arris's eyes softened behind his glasses. "Ah, you must be the heir. I knew Alara, a brilliant, tragic woman." Arris told the story. The Vances and the Thornes had been partners decades ago, back in the 1970s. But Marcus Thorne's grandfather, a ruthless man, had systematically cheated Alara's father, faking ledgers and stealing patents. "It wasn't a sudden death," Arris said, his voice low and sad. Alara's father was bankrupted. He lost everything. He died a few years later from illness and, I believe, a broken heart. He was left with nothing. "And Alara?" Leo asked. "A genius and inventor just like her father. But she became a recluse. She spent her life meticulously planning. She wanted to restore her family's name. And she researched her lineage. She found you, Leo. She knew you were the last of the line. She knew you were a veteran. She didn't pick you by chance. She believed only someone with your kind of integrity could finish what she started." Arris's words echoed in Leo's mind as he drove the rattling pickup truck back to the tower. Alara hadn't chosen him by chance. He wasn't just an heir. He was a candidate, chosen to finish a fight. He entered the library, the storm having passed, leaving the room in a heavy, dusty silence. Shadow immediately trotted ahead, his claws making faint clicking sounds on the hardwood floor. The shepherd went straight back to the paneled wall between the bookshelves, the exact spot he had indicated on their first night. "Okay, boy," Leo murmured, kneeling. "You were right about Thorne. Let's see if you're right about this." He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own eyes. Leo ran his fingers over the dark wood. It was smooth, solid, and seamless. But as he pressed near the bottom, where Shadow had nudged, he felt a small, hidden latch. The panel clicked open, revealing a dark, velvet-lined compartment. Inside was a single object, a thick leather dog collar, cracked with age. Attached to it was a heavy, non-tarnished metal tag expertly carved into the shape of a stylized seagull in flight. Leo held the tag, the metal cool against his skin. This must have belonged to Tempest, the dog Arris had mentioned, Alara's own K9. He clutched the tag and stood up, scanning the room. He was no longer looking for flaws. He was looking for a match. His eyes landed on the massive cold stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. There, carved deep into the center of the heavy oak mantelpiece, was the same identical seagull. He stepped closer, running a hand over the carving. But Shadow wasn't looking at the mantel. The dog was focused lower down, at the hearth, sniffing intently at the dark brickwork just above the floor. He let out a low, inquisitive huff, then nudged a single brick with his nose. Leo knelt again. He put his hand against the brick Shadow had indicated. It was loose. And more than that, he felt it, a faint, steady draft. Cold air, smelling of deep earth and damp stone, was seeping from the gap. "Good boy," Leo whispered, his heart beginning to pound. He retrieved the crowbar from the back of his truck. He was careful, wedging the steel tip gently into the old mortar. The brick came loose with a dry, scraping sound. Leo pulled it free and set it aside. He shone his flashlight into the hole. It wasn't a complex mechanism. It wasn't a trap. It was just a cold, simple iron lever set vertically into the stone. Leo took a deep breath and pulled. A low, grinding rumble vibrated up his arm and through the floor. It was the sound of heavy gears engaging, a sound of stone scraping stone. One of the towering bookshelves to the left of the fireplace began to move. It slid slowly, protesting sideways into the wall, revealing a dark, narrow opening and stone steps leading down into the earth. The stone steps descended into cold, still air. Leo held his flashlight high, sweeping the beam, while Shadow stuck close to his leg, the dog's senses clearly on high alert. The passageway opened into a large, rectangular room carved directly out of the cliff's foundation. It was Alara's workshop. Blueprints and mechanical drawings were pinned to the damp stone walls, their edges curled and yellowed. Rusted tools lay on heavy wooden workbenches, and in the center, built into the far wall, was a massive, black riveted safe. It was not a modern vault. It was an old industrial behemoth of iron and gears. Leo ran his light over it. No combination dial, no keyhole. Instead, he traced the heavy mechanics built around it. On the far left wall was a heavy iron lever. On the far right wall, near the floor, was a recessed pressure valve. Leo tried the lever. It wouldn't budge, as if locked. He crossed the room and stepped on the pressure valve. It hissed and sank under his weight, but nothing happened. He sprinted back to the lever, but by the time he reached it, the valve had already reset with a soft sigh. "It's a two-person job," Leo muttered, rubbing his hand over his face. He looked at Shadow, who was watching him intently, his head cocked. How had Alara done this alone? He paced the room, frustrated, his eyes scanning for another clue. He stopped. His gaze fell on his own belt, where his canine leash was clipped. It wasn't a standard leash. It was a 2-inch wide band of black tactical nylon, rated to hold hundreds of pounds of pulling force. An idea sparked. He unclipped the leash. He went to the pressure valve, looped one end of the leash around a thick, exposed pipe on the wall above it, and then fed the other end through the valve's handle. He put his foot on the valve, depressing it, and pulled the leash tight, cinching it down. The nylon strained, but it held. The valve was locked in the down position. He jogged back to the lever. He put his hand on the cold iron, and Shadow growled. It was not a loud sound, but it was deep and absolute. The shepherd, who had been relaxed a moment before, was now rigid, standing at the base of the stairs, staring into the darkness above. His ears were swiveled forward, his ruff bristled, and the low, warning rumble vibrated in his chest. He had heard something. A scrape of stone? A footstep? The sudden tension was suffocating. Leo knew that sound. It was Shadow's imminent threat warning. They were running out of time. He gripped the lever with both hands and threw his entire body weight into it. This time, with the valve held down, the lever moved. A series of heavy metallic clunks echoed through the chamber, and the massive safe door swung open with a low groan. Leo shone his light inside, ignoring the stairs for just 1 second. It was packed. Thick, leather-bound ledgers, financial documents, and on top, a thick envelope sealed with wax, which held a stack of letters and a long, handwritten confession. Tucked beneath it all was a single, rolled-up map, drawn on what looked like waterproof oilskin. He could hear a faint sound from above now. Shadow was right. Leo snatched the oilskin map, his mind racing. He stuffed the ledgers and the confession into his backpack. Shadow's low, insistent growl was still rumbling, confirming they were not alone. The map wasn't another blueprint of the house. It was a coastal chart, showing a spot just north of the tower. The sea cave. She hid it outside, Leo whispered. She knew they'd search the house. He looked at Shadow. We're leaving, boy. Now! They bolted up the stone steps, Shadow at his heels. The wind howled as they burst from the library. The sky, visible through the tall windows, was a bruised, churning gray. Miles away, in a sterile office, Marcus Thorne watched a red dot on his monitor. The tiny GPS tracker his associate had planted on the pickup's frame was finally moving. It was leaving the tower, heading north along the old, dangerous cliff trail. He found the map, Thorne said, standing up. He nodded to the large, silent man standing by the window. Let's go. The truck skidded on the muddy track. Rain began to lash the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. Leo parked where the trail ended at a sheer drop. The map showed a hidden goat path. He and Shadow scrambled down the wet black rocks, the sea spray stinging their faces. The cave entrance was a dark slash in the cliff, a sound of roaring water echoing from within. Inside, the noise was deafening. Leo's flashlight cut through the gloom. There, in a high recess above the tide line, just as the map promised, was a large, metal-banded chest. The Hoard. I really must thank you, Leo. The voice was smooth, cold, and amplified by the cave walls. Leo spun. Marcus Thorne stood at the entrance, blocking the sliver of gray light. Beside him stood the bodyguard, a thick-necked man in a rain slicker, holding a long steel crowbar. Just hand over the map and the contents of that chest, Thorne ordered, and we can avoid any unpleasantness. The bodyguard took a heavy step forward, raising the crowbar. Leo didn't have to give a command. Shadow launched himself forward. He did not attack. He landed, feet planted, between Leo and the bodyguard. A deep, terrifying bark exploded from his chest, echoing off the stone. He snapped his teeth at the air, his gray ruff bristled, a clear and lethal barrier. The bodyguard instinctively flinched, taking a half-step back. It was all the time Leo needed. Trained for this exact moment, he moved. He lunged past Shadow, grabbing the man's wrist, the one holding the crowbar, and twisted. He used the man's momentum, slamming him against the wet cave wall. The crowbar clattered loudly to the rocks. It was a K9 handler's takedown, swift, efficient, and decisive. "Stop him!" Thorne shouted, but a massive wave suddenly crashed into the cave entrance, surging around their ankles. The storm was here. The tide was rising, fast and violent. "Shadow, this way!" Leo yelled. He grabbed the backpack and shone his light where the map had indicated, a narrow crevice high up the back wall. He scrambled up the rocks, pulling himself into the tight space. "Heel, boy, up!" Shadow, agile and powerful, leaped and scrambled up after him. They emerged, soaked and breathing hard, onto the cliff path above the cave. Below, another wave flooded the entrance. They could hear Thorne shouting in terror. Leo looked down. Thorne and his bodyguard were trapped on a high ledge, the water rising below them. They were safe from drowning, but they were not going anywhere. Leo pulled out his phone. He dialed 911. "Yes," he shouted over the wind. "I need the Coast Guard. There are 2 men trapped in the sea cave, just north of Sea-Watch Tower. Yes, and you should probably send the police, too. They're here for trespassing." The flashing blue lights of the Coast Guard cutter sliced through the storm's darkness less than 30 minutes later. Leo and Shadow watched from the cliff trail, soaked but safe, as the rescue team descended. They saw the beam of a spotlight hit the cave, illuminating the 2 pathetic, shivering figures on the ledge. The arrest was swift, but the real storm for Marcus Thorne began the next day. The evidence Leo had retrieved from Alara's workshop, the meticulous ledgers, the damning confession, and the financial records, was irrefutable. Federal investigators descended on Port Coldwater. Armed with Alara's proof, they uncovered a history of fraud that went far beyond one family. The Thorne empire, built on deceit, began to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. 6 months passed. The violent Oregon winter gave way to a bright, clear spring. Sea-Watch Tower was transformed. The broken windows were replaced with gleaming new glass. The dark, damp stone had been cleaned, and the leaking roof was mended. Where there was once darkness and decay, there was now warmth and light. The tower was no longer a tomb, it was a sanctuary, its windows shining like beacons over the peaceful Pacific. Leo stood in the restored library. The room was now filled with comfortable furniture, and the bookshelves were organized and clean. Sitting across from him, sharing a pot of coffee, was Mr. Eris. "The Vance Tempest Legacy Fund," Eris read aloud from the charter document, smiling. Ilara would be so proud. Leo nodded, his gaze resting on Shadow, who was dozing peacefully in a patch of afternoon sunlight near the fireplace. "She wanted justice," Leo said, his voice quiet. "But I think she also wanted to heal what was broken." He had used the recovered assets, the fortune Ilara had preserved, to establish the fund. Its mission was precise. The Vance Tempest Legacy Fund would provide grants to organizations across the country that rescued shelter dogs, dogs like Shadow, and trained them to be certified therapy companions for military veterans returning to civilian life, men and women like Leo. That evening, Leo walked out onto the cliff path, now a safe, restored walkway. The air was calm and cool. The sky where the storm had raged was now painted in strokes of deep orange and soft violet. The ocean, which had once sounded to Leo like a threat, was now just a peaceful, rhythmic whisper. Shadow trotted up and sat beside him, leaning his familiar solid weight against Leo's leg. It was the same simple, grounding gesture he had offered in the cramped apartment that felt like a lifetime ago. Leo placed his hand on the dog's thick ruff, feeling the steady, calm heartbeat. He watched the last sliver of the sun sink below the horizon, and he realized, with a slow, dawning sense of peace, that it had been weeks since he had woken up, at 2:04 a.m. The nightmares were gone. Ilara had left him a house and a fortune, but Shadow had led him to the true inheritance. He had a home, he had a mission, and he had his partner safe by his side. In the end, the true treasure was never the gold in the cave, but the quiet, steady heartbeat that could chase away the nightmares. Leo and Shadow's journey reminds us that the greatest fortunes are not dug from the earth, but are found in the loyalty we share and the healing we find in one another. If their story found a home in your heart, we hope you'll consider becoming part of our pack here at Paws and Narratives. The greatest gift you can give back is to share a memory of your own Shadow in the comments below. We read everyone. Subscribing ensures you'll never miss a journey, and our next adventure is already waiting for you, right on the screen. Thank you for being here.